So the first thing I want to address tonight is you are going to, as you read through the Epistle of the Romans, you are going to read the word faith and faithfulness a lot in Paul's epistle to the Romans. And faith versus law or faith versus works righteousness or something is often put in tension with one another in Paul. And one of the things I want to point out to you is every time you see the word faith, every time you see the word faithfulness in English is actually the exact same Greek word. And the Greek word is pistis, P-I-S-T-I-S. And it can be translated equally into English as faith, faithfulness, trust, loyalty. It is equally translatable into English into all of those words. And I'll give you an example. So if you look at chapter 1, verse 8, and I'm reading from the New Revised Standard Version. First, I thank my God through Jesus Christ for all of you because your faith is proclaimed throughout the world. Right? Does everyone have something similar to that? Okay. But does everyone see the word faith, or does someone have something different from faith? Okay, everyone seems to have faith there. So then if you turn to chapter 3, verse 3, chapter 3, verse 3. What if some were unfaithful? Will their faithlessness nullify the faithfulness of God? Okay, so that faithfulness of God is the word pistis. I give thanks for all of you through Jesus Christ because your faith, pistis, is proclaimed throughout the world. So in Greek, there's no difference between those two words, but the English translators have decided that there needs to be a distinction. All right. So why do I point that out to you? Because for Paul, faith is not only a set of beliefs or claims of truth, but for Paul, there is always action and behavior and ways that we live out our faith, or we live out faithfulness. Those things are all wrapped up into the same thing. We should never limit the word faith in Paul's epistles to only a set of claims or a set of beliefs. If that was what Paul meant, he would have used the right term. And the right term for that, a set of beliefs or a claim or truth claims, that word in Greek is credo.
Oh, credo. Okay.
And so that is what a creed is. A creed is a set of beliefs. And if Paul meant a set of beliefs, he would have said a set of beliefs. Instead, what Paul used was faith or faithfulness or loyalty or trust. So think about what this, so I'm just going to translate verse 1:8 with the first, I thank God, my God, through Jesus Christ for all of you because your faithfulness is proclaimed throughout all the world. Now that makes sense. That their actions, their behavior, it's not just a set of beliefs. Why would just their adherence to a set of beliefs inspire other people throughout the world? Think about the people who inspire you. It's not just what they think or what they believe that inspires you. It's how they live their life that inspires you. So I always like to point that out right off the bat. And so when Paul is then if faithfulness and faith, living out of faith, has behaviors and actions and that stuff kind of connected to it, then what is Paul meaning when he says works righteousness? Because he very much like kind of has that tension between faithfulness or faith versus works righteousness. What he's talking about is the living out a checkbox of commandments found in Torah. Paul is much more concerned with that we live between each other with truth and honesty and grace and forgiveness. That's what he's talking about, being faithful versus you're wearing blended fabric and therefore you are unclean. And therefore I cannot sit next to you. I'm sorry.
I need that.
That's works righteousness. That if I wear the right clothes, if I and I don't mean to diminish Jewish law by any means, but there are some in our modern ears and eyes, there are some absurd laws that might have made sense back in the day, but don't make as much sense today. And so he's not talking about just that checkbox of like, and then of course the big one is circumcision. That just because you're circumcised, that somehow you can claim that you are being faithful to God. He actually has a word for it in chapter 3, which is circumcision of the heart. And what he's using that as a metaphor of what God really wants is our faithfulness and how we live out our lives, not just, okay, I'm circumcised, done, check the box, I'm good to go. So I always like to start whenever we talk about Romans with that, so that as we read on, we can figure out what's going on. So verse 1:8 verses 3:3 is always a great way to just sort of bring that out. And how we live our life is as important, if not more important to Paul than having a certain set of beliefs, because really the only thing that matters to Paul is the faith that we place in God, that God has redeemed or justified the world through the death and resurrection of Christ. That's the only set of beliefs that Paul cares about. Anything other than that, you don't ever hear Paul talk about the virgin birth. Paul never brings up the virgin birth, never brings up how the miracles occurred. Paul is not about apologetics. Paul is trying to inspire us to live in a certain way. So any questions or comments or thoughts about that? Does that I don't want to say if that makes sense, but does that ring true to you as you have read through Romans so far? Okay, that's great. Okay, greatness. So, oh gosh, where to go next?
Where do I start?
Where do I start? Now that I've started, where do I start? So let's just start with something fun. I go to 1:14 because Paul uses a fun slang term that you might not know we might not know what he's talking about. So 1:14, I am in debt to both Greeks and to barbarians, both to the wise and to the foolish. Hence my eagerness to proclaim the gospel to you also who are in Rome. So who are these barbarians that Paul is talking about? That is actually a slang term. So that is slang in the ancient world for anyone whose first language isn't Greek. So so Greeks are people who speak Greek, and then barbarians are everyone else.
Mine said non-Greeks.
Non-Greeks. Okay. Yeah, so barbarians is actually what the term. So yours, Chris, actually kind of takes the fun out of it.
But it made sense. I knew who he was
Yeah.
talking about.
It makes much more
Everyone
sense.
else.
But the Greek term there actually is the Greek word for barbarians, which is slang in the ancient world for anyone who doesn't know how to speak Greek. And so those were the quote unquote barbarians. He isn't talking about Conan. He isn't talking about the Visigoths or anything else that comes much later in history. He's very much talking about in terms of language. But the very next thing, 116, is really important. So Paul's everything up to verse 16 really is just introduction, and I really didn't want to spend too much time on it because honestly, if you've read one Paul letter, you've read them all. In terms of the introduction to Paul, he's very consistent each and every time. But really, it's 116 that we really start to get into the meat. And so you get his thesis for Romans in 116. That is the power of God for salvation to everyone who has faith or faithfulness, first to the Jew and then also to the Greek or the Gentile, which basically means his thesis is that God is the one who saves the world or justifies the world or reconciles the world to God. And that salvation, that justification, that reconciliation is available to everyone. First to the Jews, the people of Israel, but then to the Greek or the Gentile, which is his shorthand for everyone else. And throughout the rest of the letter, everything else can be boiled down to that one sentence. It is his thesis. How do we become saved? It's through God. Can we save ourselves? No. Who can be saved? Everyone. How are we saved? Faith or faithfulness. Like everything will come back to that. So this is a long letter with a lot of words, and he is verbose. But if you really just want to know what the whole letter is about, always just come back to 116, and you will always come back to the thesis of Romans. And Paul will use, this is a good point, good opportunity to talk about some of these terms. Paul will use salvation, justification, reconciliation, redemption, almost interchangeably with one another. And I don't want you to get confused by that, because he really does mean the exact same thing every time he says those words, uses those words. Those of you with a certain background in finance might recognize that those are all financial terms. Justification, reconciliation, redemption, those are all money terms. Salvation, maybe not so much. But
the auditor's report.
right. Yeah, no doubt. I actually did talk to my Edward Jones person today about opening up a new Roth account and everything like that.
There you go.
I didn't know you could only put $7,000 a year in a Roth account. This is my first Roth account, so I didn't know this. So,
We'll start big.
yeah, you can't start. I thought it was, I just transfer all the money. No, you can't do that. You can't do that. So all of those terms mean the same. And ultimately what Paul is talking about in each one of those terms is, and we'll get to this through the rest of the letter, is, and we'll get through this in like chapter 6 when he starts talking about Adam and Christ and all that stuff. But basically Paul's theology is, when God created the world, everything was unified and everything was good. Then, through sin, God and humanity and God and creation, there became a gap, a gulf in between God and humanity. And the first time that God tried to fix that gap was through the law. And the law was by the law, I mean, again, the Torah, through the commandments, and that the keeping of the commandments was untenable. Like we were incapable of actually following the commandments. So then God had to try a different tact, and that different tact was Christ. And through the death and resurrection of Christ, and it's always combined, the death and resurrection of Christ, that with the death and resurrection of Christ, that gap has been merged or shrunk, and now we are unified with God again in that faith and faithfulness of Christ on the death, on the cross, and in the resurrection. And whereas in the law, we sort of had to do something to manage that gap. In Christ, we just receive that gift, and that's what's called grace. So that's Paul's theology in a nutshell of justification, reconciliation, redemption, salvation. And again, Paul will use those terms interchangeably with one another. But that's Paul's theology in a nutshell. And again, there's so many darn words in Romans that you can lose the theology. What's the phrase? You can lose the forest for the trees, because there's so much there. But again, that's the essence of Paul. So it's the power of God to save, redeem, reconcile, justify everyone, first to the Jew and then to everyone else. All right. And the reason why humanity needs to be saved is because they have what he calls it in chapter 2. I do believe, I think it's chapter 2. The power of sin. So where do we get the power of sin? Oh, I wrote down power of sin, but where is it? Oh, chapter 3, verse 9. If you want to jump ahead to chapter 3, verse 9. And then we'll come back to chapter 1 here in a second. All right, chapter 3, verse 9. Oh, yeah, chapter 3, verse 9. What then? Are we any better? No, not at all. For we have all been already charged that both Jews and Greeks are under the power of sin. And so this power of sin is, for Paul, is different from Augustine's original sin. So always remember, Augustine came after Paul and took Paul and kind of changed it. All right. Paul's understanding of the power of sin is that because every human being has free will, we have the ability to choose to sin in the eyes of God. Augustine will take that and run and basically say, no one has free will. Like we're born with sin as part of our existential state. But Paul does not say that. Paul says that all of us have this free will and this power to sin, and all of us are powerless against the power of sin. All except one. And that one was Christ. So when Paul says he was without sin, He is not saying that he himself did not have the power to sin. Paul is saying he had the power to sin, just like the rest of us, and chose not to. Therefore, is the one who is faithful. Therefore, again, Paul is so logical. Therefore, it's his death and reconciliation, which is the ultimate atonement sacrifice, which is the one that bridges the gap. This is why we could not do it ourselves. That's, again, Paul 101. So because we are powerless to sin, or we always give ourselves over to the power of sin, then we choose to do horrible, horrible things, according to Paul. The list of those horrible, horrible things can be found in chapter 1, verse 28 through 32. Now, I want to start with this before I back up and go over 1:26 and 27. Because chapter 1, verse 28 through 32, that is found, and so that list is found in so many books or epistles of Paul. This is the classic Pauline wickedness. All of this: murder, strife, malice, craftiness, gossip, slanderers, God-haters, inventors of evil, rebellious towards parents, heartless, ruthless. These are all classic Paul signs that you have given yourself over to the power of sin. You'll find this in 1 Corinthians. You'll find this in Galatians. You'll find this in so many other epistles of Paul. And for whatever reason, people don't highlight these verses. Instead, they get transfixed and fixated on chapter 1, verses 26 through 27. Though in no other epistle does Paul talk about this anywhere. So let's put this into context, because I really want y'all to know what Paul is talking about. So go back to chapter 1, verse 18. So Paul starts to talk about this idea of wickedness and the suppression of truth. And he goes through this whole litany of things, and eventually we get to understand who he's talking about. And who he is talking about can be found in chapter 1, 22 and 23. Claiming to be wise, they became fools, and they exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling a mortal human being, or birds, or four-footed animals and reptiles. Who is Paul talking about? Any idea? We have a good word for those folks. In the Old Testament, then we have a good word for those. Anyone want to take a gander on who those folks are? Who are the folks who worshipped four-legged animal? What?
The idols.
The idolaters. So who in the first century are the idolaters? Well, Romans. And there were very specific Roman sects.
As in CTS.
C-E.
S-E-C-T-S.
Yes, right. We'll get to SEX here in just a moment. But there were very clear Roman sects who worshipped the emperor as a god and who were cultish in their religious expression. And part of that was the worshiping of bull idols made in the shape of bulls, idols made in the shape of eagles, idols made in the shape of all sorts of other things. And part of their wickedness, quote unquote wickedness, can be found in the writings of Philo, of Cicero, and others, and particularly under the Roman emperors of Gaius and Nero. Temples were built to the Roman emperors where prostitution, pedophilia, and non-consensual sex was rampant. And part of the prostitution was prostitution for both heterosexual, bisexual, homosexual prostitution. And it was just debaucherous. And Paul, what's the best way I can put this? I said this last week. Paul is already uncomfortable with sexuality and sensuality. He is very much uncomfortable with any type of expression of sexuality or sensuality that happens outside the confines of traditional, what we would call traditional marriage of a man and a woman, and is very uncomfortable with any type of sexual activity that does not happen for the sole purpose of procreation. In other books and other epistles, Paul very clearly says, abstain from sex, all of you. But if you cannot control your desires, get married. And then within marriage, only have sex for the purposes of procreation. But you don't really need to procreate because
The end is near.
the end is near. Correct. So Paul is very uncomfortable. And don't take my word for this. None other than Martin Luther himself understood that this is what Paul was talking about. That what we consider to be gay relationships in the 21st century is not what Paul is talking about in the first chapter of Romans. Paul is talking about debauchery. He is talking about a power dynamics in sexuality where particularly men of wealth were going to Roman temples to have sex with people who were not necessarily there on a consensual basis. And it makes him very, very uncomfortable. Was part of that homosexual activity? Yes, but that's not the only thing that was going on. In fact, when I read this to Tammy, her response was hilarious. So I know we're recording, and baby, I'm really sorry. I'm going to call you out on this. It's going to be on YouTube. But when I read, for this reason, God gave them up to their degrading passions, and their women exchanged natural intercourse for unnatural intercourse. She said, "What does that mean?" And I said, "I don't know." She was like, "What were they?" And I'm so sorry if this offends anyone, but it was so funny. I have to say it. She was like, "What does that mean? Does that mean they were masturbating?" Because that was a sexual activity that did not happen for the purposes of procreation. I was like, "I don't know." She was like, "Well, what does Paul mean?" I was like, "I don't know." He grew up in a Jewish, like monastery. I don't think he's ever been with a woman. So anyway, so that's all. These verses take up way too much time. I've already taken up way too much time with them. But I want you to know what none other than Martin Luther himself said what these verses were about. But I also want to make sure you have an opportunity to ask any questions. Does anyone have any questions about all this? Don't be afraid. All right.
I have to offer up, at least in one version of the two Bibles that I've got here. He kind of sets it up as, giving them over to shameful lusts.
Yeah.
Which then kind of, rather than speaking specifically to homosexuality, created this very large category that simply went to the different activities that they were participating in. So I didn't necessarily read it as that's homosexuality specifically was sinful, but it was just part of this lusting thing that he was talking about. So
there is no consensuality here. There's no equality here. There's no love here. Those are the things that we want to aspire to And
Well,
I
that's
think
relationship.
it's relationship, and this is the very opposite of
Yeah.
relationship. And that's a great way of putting it, Chris. I appreciate you adding that. But again, verse 28, chapter 1, verse 28 through 32 is infinitely more important for us than chapters 21, 26, and 27. So that being said, let's move on to something even more confusing, which is chapter 2 and 3. The reason why chapter 2 and 3 are confusing is because chapter 2 and 3 are called Paul's diatribe. But in the English translation, none of us probably were being told that this is multiple voices speaking to each other in a dialogue. Instead, their version is probably written in a paragraph, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there is no distinction between who's talking at all, right?
Right. Right.
So that makes it incredibly difficult to understand. Chapter 2, verses 1 through 16, is Paul having a theoretical conversation with a Gentile. Chapter 2, verses 17 through 29, Paul is having a hypothetical, theoretical conversation with a Jew.
17 through what?
29.
Okay.
And then chapter 3, he's back to talking to the Gentile, the hypothetical, theoretical Gentile. Particularly in chapter 3, it's a question and answer. So can you go with me to chapter 3 for a second? You go to chapter 3. The Gentile asks, then what advantage has the Jew? Or what is the value of circumcision? Paul responds, much in every way, for in the first place the Jews were entrusted with the oracle of God. The Gentile asks, what if some were unfaithful? Were their faithfulness nullified the faithfulness of God? Paul replies, by no means. Although everyone is a liar, let God be proved true as it is written. And then he quotes scripture. Then the Gentile asks, but if our injustice serves to confirm the justice of God, what should we say? Paul and then goes, that God is unjust to inflict us wrath upon us. Paul replies, by no means. For then how could God judge the world? But if through my fault, do you see what's happening here? But if you don't recognize that Paul is having a theoretical conversation with someone else, this just sounds like a maniac who's like talking to himself. He's asking questions and answering them himself. So, but this is a very specific, ancient way of doing philosophical writings or theological writings. This is very similar to Plato's dialogues. How many of us had to read, enough of us in college had to read Plato's dialogues? But Plato at least had the decency to like tell us who was talking. Paul does not do this for us unless the directions have been lost to us. And there is good scholarship out there that believes that this portion of the letter would have come with some kind of play instructions. And that this part of the letter, like if we were going to if chapter 3 was the scripture verse on a particular Sunday, that we would do it as a dialogue. That one of us would be answering the questions and the other one, and so it would be clear that it was a dialogue, and that this is the way that this might have been presented in the first century when this letter was initially like sent. But if you're just reading this, you're like, what? This makes no sense. But it does make sense if you recognize it as a dialogue. So that being said, what is actually being, oh, because the other thing that happens constantly in the Greek is Paul goes from singular to plural, first person, second person, third person perspective, and it jumps back and forth. That in the English, again, I've said this so many times, you is you, whether it's singular or plural, and we really, Bible should have the word y'all and then.
Yeah, yeah.
So we know. So we know. So what does that mean? So now that we've kind of got that out, so chapter 2, verse 1 through 16, Paul is the theme of this section is Paul is connecting the act of faithfulness to actually having faith. And that faithfulness is more than just ticking the box, but it really is living in accordance to the way that God wants us to live in relationship with one another. And this is where Paul talks about being circumcised of the heart. And so then in then when Paul switches to the Jew, if you go to chapter 2, verse, where are we? Well, verse 7, chapter 2, verse 17. But if you call yourself a Jew and rely on the law and boast of your relation to God and know God's will and determine what is best because you are instructed in the law, and if you are sure to be a guide to the blind and a light to those who live in darkness, a corrector of the foolish, a teacher of children, having in the law the embodiment of knowledge and truth, you then that teach others, will you not teach yourself? Will you who preach against stealing not steal? You who forbid adultery not commit adultery? You who abhor idols not rob temples? He's talking about hypocrisy, and hypocrisy is the antithesis of faithfulness. But because we're all given to the power of sin, we are almost inevitably going to be hypocritical at some point. And isn't that the way it is? So that is why for Paul, the law is untenable and one cannot keep the law, is because inevitably we're going to fall short, even though we know what we ought to do according to the law. There are just going to be times in which we are hypocritical or we fall short of what that means. And so that is why it is essential that God is the one who does the saving, because we aren't able to save ourselves. So that hypothetical dialogue that Paul is having with this Jewish person is Paul is basically getting to the law makes us hypocrites, and so we need something else, because we're not going to be able to live up to that standard of that. Comments, thoughts, questions about?
Does this go back then to his comments in other places of that you break one law, you break them all?
Mm-hmm.
So we're imperfect from the start. So
right, we are, and he's going to get to the fall here in just a sec, in a couple of chapters, Chris. He's going to talk about Adam and Christ and everything like that. Which, by the way, he never blames Eve. Paul never blames Eve. He always blames Adam. It's true. He never blames Eve. He never does it. It's always Adam. But this idea that if you are going to keep, Paul actually says later on in the letter, if you want to keep the law, good for you. Like, do it. Like, it is actually a way to live in a relationship with God, but it's impossible. That's basically what he says. and so he, so this idea that it's an all or nothing, an all or nothing, it's that total sum game, the law is, and it's untenable, it's untenable. But again, chapter 3, verse 9, I want to talk about this just a little bit more. So he's going through the diatribe there, and basically the hypothetical Gentiles saying, well, we don't have to live under the law, so does that make us better off than what the Jew is, because we don't have to keep the law, we're Gentiles. And Paul says, no, you're not better off, because we've already charged that both Jews and Gentiles are under the power of sin. I said a little bit about this earlier, but I want to jump ahead and talk to you a little bit about Augustine. Augustine will take the epistle of the Romans, take this line in chapter 3, verse 9, and the chapter on Adam and Christ, and he will develop what's called the doctrine of original sin, which is not that we all have the power through free will to choose sin, and we are powerless to choose the right way on any sort of consistent basis, which is Paul's understanding. But Augustine will say our very existential state, our very spiritual condition, is a condition of sin. And therefore, we have no free choice at all. That there is no such thing as choosing to do good. That's not, Augustine's point is when we do good, quote unquote good, like that's almost accidental. That is the exception, not the rule. And this, oh gosh, you gotta love Augustine. Augustine's proof that we are born the condition of original sin is the selfishness of infants. That when an infant is hungry, if you tell the infant, I'm sorry, I can't feed you right now, the infant will throw a fit. If the infant wants a toy and you take the toy away from it, the infant will throw a fit. And will manipulate, I'm just telling you what Augustine said, and that a child will manipulate a parent to get what it wants. That is Augustine's proof of original sin, is the selfishness and the manipulation of infants, not just children, of like infants. And that they only are satisfied and not crying when they get what they want. And anyway, that's his proof. But he gets, was that?
Unfortunately, it's true.
It's right, there's no truth in it, right? Right, I know. Not a parent, by the way. I just want to always like to point that out, not a parent. And so anyway, that is not Paul's point. And sometimes people read original sin into the epistle of Romans, and that doctrine did not come for another 3 centuries after this. But because the doctrine of original sin, even for Protestants, has become kind of an omnipresent thing, Protestants don't believe in original sin. We believe in free choice, and that yes, we can do wrong a lot of times, but we also have the choice to live, in faithfulness to God. And so but we often read a lot of original sin into Paul, and it's nowhere in there. We're bringing it to the book, not the other way around. Please move ahead to chapter 3, verse 25. How are we doing on time? Oh, we're almost there. So you can take Paul out of Judaism, but you can't take the Judaism out of Paul, no matter how much he wants. But chapter 3, verse 25. Let me go back just one verse. For there is no distinction, since all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, and they are now justified in God's grace as a gift through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus. All right, you just got all the words, right? And one, like I said, he uses justification, redemption, salvation, he uses them all. Through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus, whom God put forward as a sacrifice of atonement by his blood, effective through faith. So, what makes the cross an effective sacrifice of atonement? When God put forward a sacrifice by his blood, effective through faith. What makes the sacrifice effective? It's not the blood. It's the faith. It's the faithfulness of Christ, which makes it an atoning sacrifice. We get so wrapped up in the blood. But it's not the blood, it's the faithfulness. And the faithfulness was not only honored, but was found was so effective that is the reason for the resurrection. It's the faithfulness of Christ that then all the way through the cross that makes the cross such a powerful thing, because at any point Christ could have chosen to walk away from that path. The idea that Christ came to die is not found in Paul. Paul very much understands that Christ's journey to the cross was an act of courage and will and faithfulness, not that Christ was a lamb being led to the slaughter. What makes the sacrifice effective is that Christ had the opportunity to at any point walk away and chose not to. Unlike the lamb at Yom Kippur on the Day of Atonement, the lamb has no choice. Therefore, the sacrifice is not effective. According to Paul, the sacrifice is not effective.
Also his obedience to the Father.
Right, that's what I'm talking about. It's the obedience,
Yeah.
it's that faithfulness, it's that trust. That's why it's an example unto us, Jerry. Right, exactly. But that's an interesting word, obedience, right? But faithfulness and obedience are kind of synonyms with each other. But at any point, in terms of Paul's understanding of the cross event,
yeah,
Christ could have turned away,
yeah,
walked away from the path. In the Garden of Gethsemane, Father, remove this cup from me. If not my will, all right, okay, my will. All right, and like walked away, right? It didn't finish the sentence, no, thy will be done, and walked away and said, this is no longer what I want. Christ's free will to overcome the power of sin is essential for Paul. That's what makes it such a powerful thing, because the rest of us, according to Paul, do not have that ability to not give in to the power of sin. So that's what makes it a special event. And Paul goes back, even though he's talking to a Gentile audience who may have no understanding of what the Day of Atonement is or a sacrifice of atonement is, Paul can't get out of his own Judaism, and he uses it as an example of what's going on with God. But again, it's the faithfulness, not the blood, that is important for Paul. So there's some of those old hymns about like being washed in the blood of Christ and everything. What we really want to do is be washed in the faithfulness of Christ. That's so much more important than being washed in the blood of Christ.
Was atonement unique to the Jewish
It wasn't.
people at
No.
that time? Because I understood what atonement meant.
Yeah. No, it wasn't.
Okay.
It wasn't. In fact, all those horrible religious cults that Paul is raging against in chapter 1 were also known to,
Everybody else.
yeah, they to slaughter cows and stuff like that and blah, blah, blah. So no, atonement sacrificial atonement is not unique to Judaism by any means. So last but certainly not least, last thing we'll talk about today is chapter 3, verse 30. You'll go there. So is God the God of the Jews only? No, God is not, or is God not the God of the Gentiles also? Yes. So that's the question. Paul replies, yes, of Gentiles also, since God is one. So there's something called the Shema Israel. It is Judaism's great contribution to world religion. The Shema Israel. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. Judaism invented monotheism. In a world of pantheistic religions, polytheistic religions, Judaism is the recognized first monotheistic religion. Paul takes Jewish monotheism and makes it universal. That God is not just the God of Israel, but the God of all creation and all humanity. And that grows out of Judaism, but Paul makes it a very central part of Christianity, that the God of Israel is the God of all creation and the God of all humanity. And so Paul is very much an adherent of the universal God. And this is where we get this God, the God is one, but God is also for all. And we get that in chapter 3, verse 30. So, whew. And that's just chapters 1, 2, and 3. So if you will do me a favor, we'll read chapters 4 through 7 next week because like if we're going to be done by May 15th, then we have to do one week of more than 3 chapters. So we'll do 4 through 7. And hopefully you learned something tonight and were inspired and had your faith fed just a little bit as well.